Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Casey. This is Casey Undercovers, where we talk about all things books. Today we are going to go over my October wrap-up and my November TBR. To me, this is the height of cozy season. I'm feeling cozy fantasy. I'm feeling nonfiction November. I'm feeling witches still, a little bit of a spooky season hangover. I did have a really good reading month in October, so let's get into that. For the month of October, I read a total of 8 books. I had a really solid reading month. I was really vibing with spooky books and spooky season. Even though some of these books were a little bit short, I don't take away from them being absolutely great. The 8 books I read this month were The Ex Hex by Erin Sterling, Ozma of Oz by L. Frank Baum, The Return by Rachel Harrison, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson, A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, and The Night House by Nesbo. Now let's take a closer look at the books I read in October. Spoiler warning just in case for any of these book reviews. I try not to spoil them too much, but for The Night House in particular, I feel like I kind of have to spoil it a little bit to give a proper, well thought out version of my opinion on it. The first book I read in October was The Ex Hex by Erin Sterling. This is the first book in a trilogy, but I personally am going to be reading it as a standalone. It is a romance fantasy book that takes place in a small town and has lots of fall witchy vibes, very cozy. In this book, we follow Vivian, who has just broken up with her boyfriend, and she, in a bit of a drunken upset, accidentally hexes him, and we take a little time jump. I think it's like 10 years later, and he comes back to town, and him coming back to town awakens the hex that she accidentally put on him, and it causes a lot of disruptions with the magic that runs through this small town of Graves Glen. And the book is basically about the two of them reuniting, rekindling, and trying to fix the hex and lift the hex that she put on him that's disrupting the town's magic. If I had to sum this book up in like a sentence or two, I would say that it's Halloween Town for adults, and they smash. It's got a bit of spice to it. And while romance books aren't really my thing, witchy vibes definitely are. I ended up giving this book 3.25 stars. I thought it was plenty entertaining for what it was. Like, the writing was pretty trash, and I didn't love the chemistry for the most part. I really wasn't feeling the chemistry I kept being told that they had until like page 234 out of a 308-page book. So I didn't think it was that great. If you want a simple, fun, fall vibes, witchy romance, then this will do it for you, but I'm sure it's not the best out there. Now, I read The Ex Hex as both the buzzwordathon pick for the month of October, the buzzword being relationships, and the buzzword in the title being X, that's the relationship, they are X's, and it was also a prompt for my library card game for a reading list pick, the reading list being the buzzwordathon list, and stars on the cover. Also, I just want to mention that the talking cat that only says treats was adorable, and I want one immediately. The second book I read in October was Ozma of Oz by L. Frank Baum. This is the third book in the Wizard of Oz series. In September, I had been reading a collection, like I have a volumed collection of all the Wizard of Oz books, and volume 1 has books 1, 2, and 3, Ozma of Oz being the third. So I finished that book. I read this Ozma of Oz, and it is a children's classic fantasy story. I think these Wizard of Oz books are really fun. You know, this one in particular was filled with themes of friendship and using your imagination to solve problems. This book seemed to be the inspiration for the story, or rather the movie Return to Oz. They kind of took the story from this book and mixed in some characters from the previous book, The Marvelous Land of Oz, to make the movie Return to Oz. So it's nice to have that little bit of tie-in to understand where they got that movie from. So in Ozma of Oz, Dorothy is back as the main character, and she is on a trip to Australia with her uncle, and she ends up getting washed overboard with a chicken named Bellina. And Dorothy washes up in the land of Ev. Now, the land of Ev is next to the land of Oz. And as with what seems to be all Oz books, the book starts with Dorothy kind of collecting friends to help her in her adventure along the way. She meets Tick-Tock, who is a mechanical man. She meets Princess Langwidere. Is that how you say it? In the movie, they substitute Mombi as this princess, but this is a princess who has like 30 different heads she likes to put on and wear different heads and be vain and self-absorbed, and she's like the heir to the land of Ev, because the Queen of Ev and her 10 children were imprisoned by the Gnome King. And it's up to not only Dorothy, but also Ozma from the previous book returns in this book, and they go to the Gnome King to release the Queen of Ev and her 10 children, who have been turned into ornaments by the Gnome King. He collects people as ornaments, and has imprisoned them all. And this princess is like ruling the land of Ev, but not really. She's more obsessed with doing whatever she wants by herself. So it's up to Dorothy to release and save everyone. I really enjoyed this book. I don't know if it's a little bit of nostalgia kicking in from having watched the movie Return to Oz when I was younger, but I gave this book 4.5 stars. I thought it was really cute and really fun. I thought it was also better than the previous book, so I really did enjoy this one and would really recommend checking it out, especially if you've seen the movie. And this would conclude the late fine that I had to pay up for not finishing my summer TBR, so I have now completed my late fine for my library card game. The third book that I read in October was The Return by Rachel Harrison, which is a horror book, and I would also say that it falls into the subgenre of pink horror. And since I keep forgetting to tell you at the beginning of my introduction of these books, the prompt that I used this book for from my library card game was a suspense book written by a female author. Now let me say that I loved this book a lot more than most other people seem to. I read Cackle by Rachel Harrison last year and I absolutely loved it. So I really wanted to read another Rachel Harrison book this year for spooky season, and this one did not disappoint me. Now, in The Return, we follow a group of 4 women who have been friends since they were younger, and one of their friends, Julie, goes missing. She disappears and is gone for 2 years, and we see a bit of the grieving process through the main character, Elise. But after 2 years, Julie all of a sudden appears on her front porch. She's emaciated, she's gross, she's been through hell, and she doesn't remember what happened to her or where she's been. In an effort to help kind of rehabilitate Julie and just to see her again, the 4 women go to a retreat to a hotel, a boutique style hotel where every room is themed and very art deco, and I mean themed like in the extreme. Like the colors are crazy. There's a jungle room with crazy plants and wallpapers and things. Like the setting of this book was absolutely my favorite part. I loved this hotel setting that's out in a foggy, foresty Maine setting, almost worthy of Stephen King. Now, while the women are on their trip, Julie is acting not quite like Julie. She looks like Julie, a skinny Julie, but she looks like Julie. She's talking like Julie. But Julie has always been a vegetarian, and she is chowing down on bloody meat. Rare steaks, weird raw meat. Julie is not acting right, and all of the girls are very concerned. They don't really understand what's going on, and weird things in the hotel start happening. And like I said, I really loved this book. I gave it 4.5 stars. I thought it was a lot of fun. And this is not just a typical horror kind of, is she possessed? Is she a demon? Is she a monster? What happened to her? It's also at the heart a true story about friendship and women's friendships and how they change over time, how you compare yourself to your friends. It was very good for that kind of thing. I feel like a lot of people maybe didn't like this book so much because you don't get a definitive answer of what really Julie has become, but I think I figured it out. If you've watched Supernatural, you probably have no problem figuring out what Julie is, what happened to Julie, what Julie is now. Now, if you are in the mood for something spooky, if you are in the mood for some gore and body horror and a monster story with friendship and grief and change at the heart of it, this book is for you. Other people are haters. I loved it. The fourth book I read in October was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This is a gothic mystery, romance, suspense, historical fiction, so many things all in one. And oh my God, why did I wait so long to read this book? It was so fucking good. Before I get into why it was so fucking good, I read this book for my library card game, and the prompts were a mystery book with a black cover. In Rebecca, we follow our narrator, who is unnamed, and her relationship as it develops with Maxim de Winter, who is an influential, wealthy man from England who is the owner of the estate Manderley. When we meet our narrator, she is working as a companion to a wealthy American woman in Monte Carlo in the south of France, and her and Maxim meet in a hotel and begin developing a relationship. But when the wealthy American woman is to return to America and take our narrator with her, Maxim proposes marriage to her and gives her the option to come with him to Manderley or to go on to America with her employer. And of course, she takes the offer of marriage and becomes Mrs. de Winter. They move back into Manderley after their honeymoon, and unfortunately, Maxim had been grieving when she met him. Everybody knows that he lost his beloved wife Rebecca a year ago, just about, when she tragically drowned when her boat capsized. And when she arrives at Manderley, she meets the staff and Mrs. Danvers, who is the head of the staff, and everything starts to feel a little bit uncomfortable. In the house in Manderley, a beautiful estate, all of Rebecca's things are still there. This staff was her staff. They all knew her. She's sitting down at her desk. It was Rebecca's desk. Everything has Rebecca's name on it. The woman's presence, she was so great at everything, and she was so charismatic, and everyone adored her, and her presence is still felt throughout the house and felt in her marriage. Even though Rebecca is gone and dead, and she's not a literal ghost, her memory is haunting our narrator in this house. And this is the story, really, of what happened to Rebecca, how it affects our couple, how it affects Manderley, the estate. And I did not see so much coming in this book. There are twists and turns and just mind-blowing moments, and it was just getting me every time. Oh, it's so good. I will say, though, I got myself really frustrated reading this book because every time this woman would do something, like if she breathed, someone would be like, Mrs. de Winter, Rebecca didn't breathe that way. She breathed the other way. And she just could not escape this. Mrs. de Winter did this, and Rebecca did that, and you're not doing it the way she did it. And I was like, can you give this girl a break? And she's a young woman. She's in her early 20s. Maxim is in his 40s. He married a young woman to, kind of take his mind off. And he does love her. They do love each other. But to take his mind off his grief, this woman is a sunshine in his clouds. Clouds have been descending on him for quite some time, and she's just breaking all that up. But no one can let this woman be, man. It was driving me crazy. I felt so bad for her. I loved this book. I gave it 5 stars, no contest, maybe the best book I've read all year. It's between this one and The Glass Castle. I love this book. I would recommend it to literally every single person ever. If you haven't read it, you need to. If you don't read classic literature, you do now. If you don't like mystery books, you do now. This is it. And I don't know if this is my favorite book ever now, but it's definitely in the top 5. Do it if you haven't. The 5th book I read in October was The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, which is a gothic horror novel. And the prompt I read this for was a mystery that was published before 1900, and this was a reread for me. I read this book in high school 15 years ago, but I was definitely due for a reread. Now, back in high school, I remember liking this book, even as a classic book. I didn't get into classic literature until recently, but even more so now as an adult, I appreciate a lot more, and I gave this book 4.5 stars. I really thought it was very good. I really liked it. Some other horror books that were written around this time period have a very mopey, sad, crying theme throughout the book. This one did not have that, which I really appreciated, because if Dr. Jekyll would have cried the whole time, I'd have lost my marbles. Now, this story is about Dr. Henry Jekyll, but it does take place from an outside perspective of a friend of his who is also his lawyer. And while this man is out for a walk with another friend of theirs, he starts to tell his friend the story of a man that he encountered who came out of a door that they're passing, and that man attacked a young person, a young girl in the street, and stomped her. And he's just a damnable character, this horrible creature, and this person turns out to be Edward Hyde, and Edward Hyde is an associate of Dr. Jekyll's, so we think. Now, you probably know this story via cultural osmosis. It's been around forever. My first encounter with this story was in The Pagemaster, when Richard, is it Richard? I think his name is Richard. Macaulay Culkin in that movie, I think his name is Richard. When he encounters Dr. Jekyll, who then turns into Mr. Hyde when they're going through the genre of horror. So that was my first encounter with this story. But to get the full story of it and the really struggle between good and evil and nature versus science and the actual concept of human nature and what it means to be human and have the choice between good and evil, rather than, as Dr. Jekyll in this book makes a chemical concoction that turns him into only the evil side of himself, which is Edward Hyde. And this book does an excellent job of showcasing the duality of human nature and the evil that we repress based on societal standards. And he really lets it go when he drinks this potion and becomes Mr. Hyde. This book is very short. My copy is 99 pages. It's not even 100 pages long. And if you have not read this book, it is a great book to read. Just for a quick read, just for a gothic read, just for a sci-fi read, just for a little bit of horror, just for a little bit of mystery. It covers so many bases and just is really so well fleshed out for being only 100 pages. And it is something of a tragedy. But I really enjoyed this book and would definitely recommend it. The 6th book that I read in October is A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This is a gothic romance historical fiction retelling of Dracula. And my prompt for this book from my library card game was a horror book with blood on the cover, and it was a perfect choice for spooky season. Now again, romance is not really my cup of tea, but vampires are. Some of the very first books that I ever read, adult books, my sister read to me were vampire books. Interview with the Vampire and Salem's Lot by Stephen King. I have always had a weakness for vampires, and this book is no exception. Now, this book had a very interesting format. It was written from the perspective of our narrator, Costanza, who was Dracula's first wife, and she writes this book as if telling the story in love letters almost to Dracula, to her husband, after she has killed him. The book opens with her admitting that she did not plan on killing him. It is what came after all of these years and all of these circumstances convened to this outcome. And in this book, Costanza was a peasant girl whose village was attacked. She was brutally attacked and left for dead. Dracula seems to have found her in her dying, weakest moment and gives her her new name of Costanza. We never know what her original name was. Helps her seek her vengeance for the death of her family and for the crimes that she has suffered. Brings her into his world, brings her into his castle, and treats her like his beloved wife, princess, but not is all blood and roses. He is very manipulative, very nearly abusive. He doesn't really hit her, but you can tell that he's gaslighting her, he's manipulating her, he's controlling her. It's just a very toxic relationship. And later on in their relationship, they go and see somebody that he has been corresponding with. And this person is Magdalena. She is an aristocrat. She is very clever. She hosts lavish parties. She lives in a lavish home. And Magdalena and Dracula, even though he's never named in the book, we know that's who it is. They have been corresponding behind Costanza's back for quite some time. She's very jealous. She's enraged. This is her husband. But they've always had lovers, just no one that he's kept in contact with. But of course, they've arrived at her home to also turn her and bring her into their family. And at first, Costanza is very against this idea, does not want Magdalena in her husband's bed, but she too falls for Magdalena's charm. The two become very close. In the original book of Dracula, he has 3 wives. In this retelling, it is a husband named Alexei. He's a young 19-year-old model in Russia, and Dracula turns him as well. And these 3 become very close. They bond over the abuse that they endure by Dracula and the manipulation they endure from him, and eventually turn against him. And this book's strongest point was most definitely the readability and the writing. The writing was very beautiful, or I would DNF this book because it's just not my cup of tea. So it was a Dracula retelling that was held together by the thinnest strings of lace. I really wish we would have gotten more of Dracula's story, of the original story, in this story. It was more like Easter eggs kind of planted very sparsely throughout the book, rather than an ultimate or true retelling. It was spicy if you want a spicy vampire book, if you want something that's poetically written, if you want a little bit of historical fiction, a little bit of gothic, a little bit of romance, this book can get you there. Overall, I gave it 3.75 stars, and that's probably a little bit generous. The writing and readability really saved this book. The 7th book that I read in October is A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. This book is a lot of things. It's a classic. It's a dystopian, it's a sci-fi, it's a crime book, it's horrific, it's banned, it's a lot. And my prompt for my library card game for this book was a dystopian published between 1950 and 1970. A Clockwork Orange is the story of Alex and his droogs, or his friends, that are hooligans and horrible and brutal and violent and evil and terrible and any other adjective that you can think of that goes along with those words. Now, although Alex is only 15, he is the youngest of his group, but kind of the leader of the group, and they go out on their nightly crime spree. You know, they're robbing people, they're beating people, and they end up at a country home that they invade. They go in, they brutalize the wife in horrible ways, they beat the husband, and they leave them basically for dead. Then they end up in another apartment one day where, Alex has kind of overstepped his bounds by punching his friend in the face, and they kind of turn against him. They boost him into this woman's house. She's got a billion cats. She's feeding her cats, and he sees something that he wants. Alex has a fascination with classical music, Mozart, Beethoven, those kind of things. And he sees a bust of a statue that he wants to have, and this woman is fighting him to get him out of her house, and he ends up cracking her in the head, and she ultimately dies. This leads to Alex being arrested and imprisoned. We get a little bit of his story while he's in prison, but ultimately the book really picks up steam again when we see Alex in a hospital where he will be undergoing treatment that is supposed to cure him of his need for violence. Now, I don't want to say any more because this book is only 140 pages or so. It's very short, and anything else I say will spoil it. But it was very good. The story in itself is just like makes your bones hurt because it really gets to the core of what is good and evil, free will, nature versus evil, the duality of the individual and the role of the state in reformation of criminals, and it just gets to the heart of a lot of issues. Now, the writing in this book is amazing. Now, part of it is that the author, Anthony Burgess, created a language that they refer to as nadstat, which is kind of what the teenagers are in this book. They're nadstats. And it takes a while to get used to this language, this slang that they use in this book, but once you do, it's pretty smooth sailing. If you can't get past the language, you're not going to have a good time. You know, you just kind of have to glean what the words mean as you're reading them with context clues, but once you get into the words, it becomes fairly easy. I wanted to have thoughts when I was done reading this book, but it took me a while to make thoughts. All my brain was like, like no thoughts were coming out. Like the dial-up was not dialing up. I did not have an idea of what I had just read. But overall, I gave this book 3.5 stars. I thought the writing was amazing. I thought the plot of the story and the little voice in the back of your mind that is like, don't forget about me. It really came full throttle in the end of the book. It was very good. I would recommend it with caution because there is brutal crime in this book and you may not want to read that. But overall, if you want to read a quick book that has really solid commentary on the role of the state in reformation and in the prison systems and in how criminals are handled and brought back into our society, this would be a very good book to read. The 8th and final book that I read in October was The Night House by Nesbo. And this book is a horror book with a mystery on the side. It's about grief and coming of age, and ultimately the new poster child for subverting expectations. I thought when I was going into this book that it was going to be a Goosebumps-esque Stephen King on a weird day type book. And that is not ultimately what I got. But really quick, the prompt that I had for this book for my library card game was a mystery and a translated book. Nesbo, I hope I'm saying that right. I'm probably not, is a writer from Norway? Norwegian. Yes, he's Norwegian. So he's a writer from Norway, and I got to check another country off of my reading list. So that was fun. So I have a lot of thoughts on this book, right? Just a lot of thoughts because I was all in on this book being weird. In the very first chapter of this book, a kid is eaten by a payphone. The phone itself eats his face and his arm and devours him entirely. And I was on board for a Goosebumps style weird time. I was all in on it. And just spoiler alert for this book because I cannot get into what bothered me about this book without spoiling it. So here's your warning. Get out now if you don't want to know. This book is written in 3 parts. And the first part is the repercussions of after this kid gets eaten by the payphone. Our main character, Richard, was the only person with him. And he's accused of Tom, the kid that got eaten by the phone's disappearance. And he's like, nope. He got eaten by a phone. You got to listen to me. And they're like, no, you're a weird, troubled kid from outside of our town. Like, we're not listening to you. You obviously threw him in the river or something. And Richard, pairs up with his friend Karen, who he's secretly in love with because he's a teenage boy. And they kind of start to try to figure out what's going on. He also takes another kid from his class named Jack to the night house looking for information. There's a weird villainous loom with a character named Jonason, Jonathan, IMU, whatever his name was. It ended up not mattering, so I guess whatever. I can mispronounce it all I want. They go to the night house. They see some weird shit. They go back to Richard's house. You know, him and Jack, who he so lovingly called Fatso. What a dick. And, you know, he ends up somehow using magic words, changes Jack into a cicada and tries to crush him, but Jack ultimately gets out in cicada form out of the house and disappears. And now we have 2 kids that have disappeared after having last hung out with Richard. And you kind of see where this is going. And the police don't believe him and yada yada. They send him into an asylum at some point because he's a crazy, murderous kid, troubled, whatever. He's telling all these people all this weird shit happened. He's honest about what he's seen. And they send him off to the asylum, hoping that he'll get treatment and that he'll ultimately just confess to what he's done with these kids. But he sticks to his story. We see his time in the hospital. We see him having good behavior and whatever. Then he gets a letter from Karen. He gets a weird phone call. He needs to escape. He needs to go back to his hometown. He needs to go back and prevent her from getting hurt or whatever. He escapes with the help of 2 weirdo twins. I forget about them almost. Victor and Vanessa, I think, are their names. He escapes with them. They end up back in the town. They go back to the night house. The house catches on fire. They burn down the house. I don't remember. They burn down the house. The 2 twins are killed in the fire. He finds Karen at their secret spot at their high school or whatever on the roof, which is the secret place only they know about. And he saves her when she's about to kill herself and throws herself off the roof. She gets caught in a fireman's net. She saved her, right? He's the hero, right? End of part 1. Part 2 starts by saying he's an adult now. 15 years has passed or whatever. He's going back to a high school reunion. And that whole story I just read was a kid's story that he wrote and none of it was real. And now I'm mad. I am mad. And this happens not once, but twice in this book. Where part 2, whatever happens, happens. At the end, it was a dream. And he's really a schizophrenic in a fucking mental hospital. He's got PTSD. He's getting electroshock therapy. And everything you read in this entire book was a dream and or hallucination based on his life in the hospital. And it's all caused by trauma from when his father murdered his mother. And his father was also schizophrenic. So, like, the rug just kept getting pulled out from under my feet, which really pissed me off. Like, I was in for weird, but I was not in for nothing you read mattered. And that really made me mad. I know this book wants me to stop and rethink what I've read, but really it just made me annoyed that it wasn't a Goosebumps book, which is what I really wanted. You know, if Subverting Expectations needed a new poster child after season 8 of Game of Thrones, this one can take over now. I gave this book 3 stars. It had potential. It wasn't great. The writing wasn't good. It was readable. I liked the small town setting. I liked the idea of the kid getting eaten by the phone like in a Goosebumps book. I thought that was fun, but I did not overall care for this was all a dream. None of this happened. He's just schizophrenic. I didn't like it. This book made me angry. Can you tell? Ooh, I promise I'm okay. I promise I'm not having a mini stroke, a panic attack, anxiety attack, or heart attack at the moment. I'm just fine. So, the best book that I read in October, hands down, no competition, was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I absolutely loved it. 5 stars, possibly the best book I read this year. Definitely top 5 books I've ever read, ever, forever. Loved it. Now, the worst book that I read in October is probably no surprise to you. It would be The Night House by Nesbo. Why, yo? Would you do this to me? It did not have to be this way. It really didn't. I was rooting for you. No one on Goodreads was rooting for you, but I was, and you let me down. Now let's transition from spooky to cozy and go over my November TBR. Now, I have no rollovers for this month, but I do have the remainder of my library card game books that need to be read this month. I had a library hold come through, and I'm hoping to get Anna's pick finally read. So let's go through those. Now, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you may remember that I let my friend Anna pick a book for me to read, or rather, I picked a book from a list of books she wanted to read, and that counted as her pick for me, and I chose Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. But you may have wondered what happened to that, because I never did read it. Kind of what happened is that I got into the spooky vibe, I got into scary spooky season, and it didn't fit the vibe. However, now that I'm completely drunk off of horror books, I'm ready for something lighter, fresher, and different. So I think Piranesi really fits the bill. I'm going to be starting November off reading Piranesi. I'm going to start it today, and hopefully that means that I won't pass it up again. I'll actually be able to finish it this time. For the buzzwordathon for the month of November, our buzzword is the word only. So the word only needs to be somewhere in the title. And for this prompt, I am reading The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. I've never read anything by this author before, but I know his books are really popular on BookTube, so I have pretty high expectations for this. But it is a horror book, so I'm not quite ready to read another horror book right this moment. So I think I'm going to wait till later in the month to read it. So very rarely do I actually get to read the books I put on hold at the library, through the Libby app, different ebooks and audiobooks. I tend to have my plate full with other books that I'm prioritizing, but I really think it's time to prioritize one of these library books. And this time around, that would be Heir to the Empire. This is book 1 of the Thrawn trilogy by Timothy Zahn. And I've put this book off and put it off and put it off. And I really do want to read a Star Wars book. And, when I looked it up, there are hundreds of Star Wars books. But so many people said that you have to start with the Thrawn trilogy, that's a good place to start. So I really do want to do that. And I'm hoping that I will have this book read this month. And then if I need to push some of my library card game books into December, then I can do that. I have the ability to do that because I don't plan on having an official TBR in December. I plan on finishing my year with mood reading anyway. Speaking of my library card game, this is the TBR game that I play seasonally here on my channel. I do have 5 more books to read from this list that will complete my fall TBR before I do my winter TBR in January. These 5 books will be Hour of the Witch by Chris Bohjalian for an historical fiction with an ugly cover. Sorry, book. Scythe by Neal Shusterman. This is the first book in the Arc of a Scythe series, and it is a sci-fi 400 to 500 pages. Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. This is the first book in the Regency Fairy Tales series, and it is for a fantasy with a green cover. In Order to Live, a North Korean girl's journey to freedom by Yeonmi Park for a nonfiction with a country in the title. This is also my pick for nonfiction November. And What the River Knows by Isabel Ibanez for a YA book with reptiles on the cover. I have read a short story by this author, but I did not like it. So I'm a little bit hesitant going into this book, but I already paid for it, so I might as well get my money's worth. And that's all the books I'll be reading in November, I think. Before we go, just a little bit of quick housekeeping. I want to thank you all so much for a great first year here on BookTube. I just passed my first year mark, and it's been great. I do have a lot of things coming up. I have my 40 by 40 list, which is mixed in with the Rory Gilmore challenge coming up. I have a mood read month in December. I'll be playing a new round of library card in January for the winter season. I have a lot of things I want to do, and I hope you'll be back to join me for them. So do like, subscribe, hit the notification bell for future videos. Happy reading, happy Thanksgiving for those in the States, and I will see you all again in December. Bye!